A week ago, Kara Swisher said we should get to the point where we don't need diversity panels or women in tech panels or whatever you call them. And the last time we had a panel like this at TechCrunch was 2010. And the reason we did not have one afterwards is that it sort of turned into a car crash in that none of the women wanted to be on the panel. Oh, no. Slide back. These are not women. All right. There you go. And it wasn't just our panel. It was a couple. Every time one of these happens, these are the headlines. Slide, slide, slide. These always go awry. Slide. Another gender equality fail. Slide. Come on. It's the one that I covered in 2010. And granted, a lot has changed since 2010, namely the makeup of our speakers. In 2010, the percentage of women speakers at Disrupt was 5%. This year it's 25%, which still sucks, but it's 5x. The percentage of women judges was 4% in 2010. This year it's 38%. The percentage of speakers that were people of color in 2010, 8%. This year, 22%. And the percentage of judges that were people of color in Disrupt 2010, it was 12%. And this year, it was 25%. So obviously, there's a long way to go with making our own conference more diverse. But we're making progress. And so I guess my question to you is, will we ever get to a point where we don't need these kinds of panels?
It would be really great if companies' diversity reflected the diversity of the audience of the products that they were building for. But at the same time, diversity is something. There was a McKinsey study in January 2015 that showed that more diverse teams, both ethnically and gender diversity, produce greater financial returns. So, diversity is a conversation where everybody wins. VCs have greater returns. Startup founders, more success. Companies have wider perspectives in the products that they're building for. And then companies foster more inclusion and empathy in their culture, which lead to greater retention and happier employees.
Tracy?
I think we need to keep talking about this until senior leadership, overall company demographics, the VC industry, everything actually represents the greater populations that they're drawing from.
Sikander?
Yeah, one day there will be no need for a diversity panel. I don't know how many years it takes to get there, but one day it will be a fact as opposed to something we're working towards. And at that day, hopefully we can stop talking about it. But yeah. I'm with the team. As long as we need to keep talking about it, we'll keep talking about it if there's something to say that's meaningful, right? So,
I hope the day where we don't have to talk about it is soon, but it's been going on for a while. My mother worked as a software engineer. She's 30 years older than me, and she was telling me the same stories back when she was in the workforce. So it's a little bit disappointing that we're still having the same conversations 30 years later, but hopefully in 30 years we will not be having these conversations.
So when did you decide to be vocal about gender and other kinds of equality in tech? When did you decide that your story or your mom's story wasn't enough and that you wanted to take it upon yourselves to speak up about it?
For me, it was after I started working for a little bit and started to have more confidence in my own work and to recognize that the way that I was being treated in industry wasn't fair, and I wanted to do something about it. Before that point, I'd always taken it as a granted that there wouldn't be very many women in engineering and that it wouldn't be diverse. And at some point, it just clicked for me that that wasn't okay and that we needed to fix it.
well, I think for me, I think it was probably about a year ago where I really felt actually that the narrative was very one-sided on women in tech. So my own background, I've been here for 20 odd years. I was a founder at a company called Yodlee, financial software company, before I went to Google, before I went to Polyvore, and then started Joyous. And so my own belief actually was that the narrative was very lopsided about what wasn't happening rather than what was. And so I penned a letter in Recode, no offense, about 4 months ago, where I surveyed, 300 women entrepreneurs and founders, right, from the last 20 years, from Diane Green at VMware, all the way to myself, all the way to Jess Lee at Polyvore, and wanted to show people that the representative view of what's actually happening for women in entrepreneurship, women who've started companies, is in fact the overall storyline is pretty damn positive from their perspective. I.e., if you ask them about their journey and how much of it was defined by being a woman versus all the other factors that contribute to the success or failure of a startup, their perspective is there is so much more to that story than just gender. And so my perspective was like, look, everybody keeps talking about the problem. I'd rather actually have women founders talk about what their experience is, collect the data on what their experience is, and then from there move towards solutions. So I came at it with a very different perspective.
And Isis, you were sort of forced into this.
Yeah, I accidentally started a global movement about diversity after writing a blog post after my company, One Login, asked to use me in a recruiting campaign. And when the ads went up, people started talking about mine as though expressing disbelief that I could actually be a platform engineer. And so I wrote this blog post that overnight turned into a global movement. And I think that anytime that there's something that is catalyzed that quickly, we're tapping into something that really needs to be addressed.
Why, and I keep on wanting to say, why do you guys, but why do you guys, or why do you ladies, think that the conversation always starts with women? There's obviously many more, diversity is by its definition, a spectrum of identities, spectrum of types of people. There's a conversation that needs to be had around people of color. This panel is not as diverse as it could be. But the conversation always enters with women. Why do you think that is?
I think it's easiest to start with women because women are 50% of the population, so it's very obvious when we're not at 50-50 that there's an imbalance. It's harder to see that for other forms of diversity. Race is the other visible diversity stat that we're looking at, but even then it's hard to know if we're representing the overall population demographics, if we should be targeting the US demographics for race or the state demographics or the city it's just harder to know if we're off balance or not. And the other thing about gender that makes it easier is that every man has a mother. Many men have wives. Many men also have sisters and daughters, and so it's easier to relate. And the socioeconomic status doesn't play into it nearly as much. When you're looking at race, there's questions of socioeconomic class. People's social networks tend to be very racially homogenous, so it's harder to relate to those different demographics. And so it's easiest to start with gender. And then race is the next one because these are the two visible markers. And all the other forms of diversity are important, and I think it's really critical that we don't just define diversity as gender diversity or racial diversity, but those are the things that we should start with, and they're the most obvious problems that we have, and they're also the easiest ones for companies to set targets around. As opposed to something, say, like, we want to have diversity in terms of extroversion and introversion. Like, we should have that as well, and that would help our companies perform better. But it's harder to survey that and make sure that you're hiring as many extroverts as you are introverts.
If you were running a huge tech company, Facebook, Google, Twitter, what's the one thing that you would do today to change the ratio of women and minorities in your company? You go back to the office, one decision to make.
I don't know if there's one thing that I would recommend.
What is the bundle of things?
Yeah, I think it's important first to understand where the problems may be within each particular organization. So one thing that we've done at Pinterest is we've had diversity consulting firms come in and look at our entire funnel, from sourcing to the hiring and evaluation process, to once people are working at the company, looking at how their performance evals are done and promotion processes. So we're looking at all parts of this, and every company will have its own biases, and so I think it's important for each company to look at its own problems and where the highest leverage points are for them, instead of saying that every company needs to do the same things to fix their problems.
I don't know. I think for me, I agree with that you could dissect every part of the funnel, and you should. I think one large opportunity in most large companies is trying to keep women in the workforce at what I call the middle part of their careers in a large company environment. This is distinct from startups. and keep that talent as opposed to losing them. So there's a lot of data that talks about women as they enter the years where they're having children, and it becomes much tougher, right? And they're in the middle point of their career. How do you help women stay in the game at that point? I think it's a really, really critical point, because we talk about women in the C-suite, we talk about women in the boardroom. Part of the challenge with making it that far is less about access to opportunity, it's being present, right? And we need to make it easier for women to stay in at very critical points in their career where they are juggling a lot. And I think, so for me, that seems like a very big inflection point, because it's where you start to see the divide on ratios, right? Even if you have a really good entry kind of ratio in the workforce as they enter your organization, by the time you end up at the top, which, as we know, creates a whole pull-down effect, right, and a role model effect, the numbers narrow because there are a lot of women who exit at some pretty critical periods. And so if they want to stay in, how do you use all the cash flow on your balance sheet, all the HR innovation, all the things you have at your disposal to be innovative at that phase?
Isis?
Well, I think helping create community and facilitating a culture that fosters empathy are incredibly important at creating retention. I think the number from the Harvard Business Review stated that 41% of women leave the tech industry after 7 years. That's a massive number. It's a really complex, multifaceted issue, and there's a lot of different ways that we can move towards a solution.
So how many of you in the audience are startup founders? All right. Of the ones that raised your hands, how many of you are thinking about diversity issues when you're hiring your team? All of you. So Kinder, when you were building your startup, when everything else, when you build a startup, it's chaotic. Everything else is sort of up in the air. You're trying to raise, you're trying to recruit people, you're trying to get people to work for less money than they could make at Facebook. Did you think about diversity while you were building Joyous, like at the beginning stages?
Well, I think there are two things going on, and one works actually against the bandwidth to think about diversity, and one works for it when you're starting a company. So the thing that works against it is, quite frankly, you're just trying to figure out how to get product market fit and to get anybody, to help give you the signal. Like, first of all, to recruit great people, period. I don't think that you're thinking about men versus women. You're just like, how do I get great people? I actually think, and the number two, you're thinking about how do I even get to the point where I'm a viable company? Those things, I think, make it very hard to be very proactive on things like ratios and are you seeing enough people? I mean, your pipeline for talent may be this slim. So talk about trying to have a full pipeline. Good luck when you're starting a company. I mean, that is the reality of it. The converse is, I think when you're starting a company and you don't have momentum, the one thing I think you also don't have is a lot of arrogance, and you understand how much you need talent. So I think what works in the favor of diversity is you will do for that person you find whatever it takes to get them on board. So on the one hand, I think there's not yet this feeling of infallibility, like, hey, we're great regardless. We don't need people to want to work with us. So I think they're two divergent things. One works sort of against thinking about diversity as a ratio, but I think you're very pro-talent. And I think you're very pro doing whatever it takes to make sure that you can get this person in a way that works for them. That's what I think the reality is of a startup. I think they're two opposing forces, and you figure it out.
I think that's a slippery slope because, in one sense, you want to get the best talent, but how do we define what the best is? Ultimately, if you don't have the network building the product that's actually going to be using the product, then how do you really know what the audience is looking for? You can do user testing all you want, but I don't think that anything really makes up for having the people that are using the product creating it.
I think the way you define what the best is through data. So First Round Capital did that survey where women, teams that had a female founder had more returns on average than teams that didn't. So I think, Tracy, one of the things that what you've done has contributed is now we have a lot of the data to make a business case that you need to match your hiring practices to the US at large or the world at large, because that's who is going to be using your products, and if you ignore them, then you're out of luck.
I think even in the case that you're not building products for the general population, just having more diversity on the team forces people to be more creative and innovative and work harder to justify why they want things to be a certain way. And so people just are generally better at cognition and creativity when they're on diverse teams, even if the demographics of the market are not necessarily like the broader population.
Do you think there's a pipeline problem?
I think there's a network problem. I think when you think about, when I talk to male founders I know about whether it's a women board member, right, for something like the board list, which I started, or whether it's just recruiting, I think it's like anything. People go to their networks for talent. So more than a pipeline problem, I think there's a network problem. I think men don't know as many great women as women know. That's true.
How do we get them to know more great women?
Well, this is where I think both data, visibility, tools like the board list make a difference, right? So for those of you who don't know, we started an initiative called the board list, which is I think why I'm on this panel, which is really aimed at putting more women on private tech boards. But at its essence, it's a curated marketplace where men and women are nominating women for boards, right? Interestingly, average number of nominations from a man in our pre-launch period were like 4 to 10. The average number of nominations from a woman endorser were like 10 to 30, right? Both wanted to contribute equally to the endeavor, both. But they're just the size of their networks was different. So I think part of it is also about tool sets that make available or visible, who you don't know who's great. And I think when we talk about sort of founders, I don't think there's any lack of desire to have a great and diverse workforce. I think it's about access to a network. And if it's not in your first order network, how do we make it easier for it to be in your second order network? Whether that's through a tool, whether that's through LinkedIn, whether that's going through the 10 women you know who are friends of yours who think they're amazing and being proactive in reaching outside your known network, because that's where I think there's a big problem.
Has Boardlist actually gotten a woman on a board?
So we're not going to talk about that yet, soon. But what I can tell you is the board list has had a tremendous amount of momentum in the last 6 months, in the last 3 months since we launched, 2.5 months in fact. And I think the biggest thing that's interesting to me is the desire of men to participate and endorse women. And in fact, the goal of the board list is it is from men and women for men and women. I think one of the issues with diversity panels is women talking about women is not nearly as powerful as men who care talking about women. And there are plenty of men who care. They want vehicles in which to also make a difference.
Raise your hand if you're a man who cares about diversity. There's all of them.
Men care. You just need to give people solutions in which they can participate.
I would like to point out that, we're making this conversation about men and women, but gender is
just one part of it.
There's so many more nuances. It's not a binary thing. Some people don't associate with being both men or a woman.
So how pivotal do you think was the Ellen Pao trial in making this the issue of the moment?
I think it was an inflection point for sure. I think that regardless of what you think about the case, there's no doubt. I've heard the phrase unconscious bias more in the last, 6 months than I've heard it in the last 20 years, being here from the time I started my first company. And so, yes, it definitely made a difference. And, it's a conversation starter, and I think that's a good thing.
I think what was really important is that once we had the data out there and people recognized that there was a problem that was quantifiable, Ellen gave a story that was there, and people relate much more to stories than they do to statistics. And I think just laying that all out there, making it a conversation piece was really important for the industry.
Yeah. I have no comments about it. I honestly don't know enough about it.
Ellen Pao was at Kleiner Perkins. She took them to trial for alleged gender discrimination and retaliation. It's a long story, but look it up. It's interesting. Do you think that because she lost the trial and now might be liable for damages, it might discourage other women or other people that don't feel like tech is a fair place from speaking up?
I think Ellen wrote a very good piece about how the court systems are not a very good way to get recourse on these issues. I do think there are still other ways to speak up that don't necessarily involve going to court, and I think the broader conversation will encourage more people to speak up, even if it's not through that system.
I think that the I Look Like an Engineer movement encouraged a lot of people to speak up. I mean, it all started from me sharing a couple personal anecdotes, and then it broke the internet and inspired other people of color, women, other minorities to do the same.
So what's next for you after the I Look Like an Engineer movement? What are you going to do? Are you going to stick out to one login? Are you going to leave and maybe build this into its own thing? What happens to this?
Well, One Login has allowed me to create a hybrid role for myself, balancing engineering with everything else going on. I'm talking to other companies that are making diversity goals to figure out what works, because there's not just one solution. The only way that we can really find or move forward is by trying a bunch of things and communicating.
So, Tracy, you said that anecdotes and stories work better than data on some level. What's one anecdote or story that you've seen with your work on these issues that encourages you?
I think there's just a lot of little stories. I've talked to some like girls or women who are just starting to consider computer science or software and are getting inspired to build things and create things where they didn't exist before. And to see their excitement about software is really rewarding, and to see them getting excited about this industry.
Sukhinder?
One thing I find encouraging.
Yeah. There's a lot of things to find discouraging,
Well,
especially
yeah,
if
I
you
mean,
look at
there's
Twitter.
a lot of things to find discouraging,
Yeah.
and there's and a lot to find encouraging. As I said, probably the most encouraging thing for me about the work on the board list is just, as I said, it's a community that is equally men and women leaders, you know, driving the agenda of kind of better performance in the boardroom and putting, you know, women in tech boards. And it's, I mean, the men are as passionate, if not more passionate, than the women on this topic. And the number of male CEOs I talk to, whether it's the CEO of Ship or Qualtrics or TripAdvisor, who are like, what else can I do? Like, what else can I do? I know a dozen great women. I've nominated. What else can I do? To me, is probably the most encouraging thing about the board list, that it really feels like it's not about women from women. It's about everybody for better performance, and recognizing that, like in a world's talent economy, you have to be harnessing 100% of the talent. Like, everybody gets it. That's encouraging.
I wouldn't say everybody gets it, but a lot of people get it, and there are starting to be
Yes.
more
Why do
allies.
people
Inside
not
of the
get
board
it?
list,
Why do people
everybody gets it.
still, Why are there still people that say I would never hire a woman CTO, or I would never? Or why did I go to a dinner where there were only 2 women out of 25 people? Why is it still this way? What's stopping it from being a place where everyone feels welcome and included, and not like they're a minority?
Because I think there's still unconscious bias. I mean, even if people say they get it at a rational level with data, you know, the reality of reacting to what's familiar is in fact true, right? I think both things can be true. I think it can be true that people get it rationally, and yet their visceral, unconscious reaction to something is, this doesn't look like something I know. I mean, I think that's a big part of it. The other part of it is kind of what I've said I think before. I think when everything is up and to the right, and you think you're infallible, whether that be a person or a company, it's very easy to dismiss thinking about things that don't look familiar, right? It's only when you're forced to be creative. You're often forced to be creative on things like talent, when things aren't going perfectly, when you really have to consider these things more deeply, that you start to examine your own biases. Quite frankly, when everything's up and to the right, it's really easy to not examine your own biases. I would just offer that. When you think you're infallible, it's very easy to not think about the harder issues.
I think it's human nature to be immediately comforted by people that you can identify with.
Yep.
And with all of these subconscious biases, I think change starts with one person. So how do we turn our judgments into curiosity about people? Instead of jumping to a conclusion about something that you don't understand, to have a little bit more curiosity.
I think next time you meet someone who has a different background from you, think, I'm not going to have any judgment about this person. I'm just going to be curious about what I have to learn from them and what they have to learn from me. All right. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.